It was high summer south of the equator, the 10th of February 1756, when the hill called Caiboaté became a killing ground. 3,000 Spanish and Portuguese regulars advanced against earthworks the Guaraní had dug by hand. Behind them waited an army of the missions, 1,700 men, with muskets, with lances, and with 8 cannon bound from cane that could each fire only a handful of times before they split. The slaughter lasted a little more than an hour. 1,511 Guaraní died. The European force lost 4 men. The trenches the defenders had dug for cover became the pits they were buried in. 1,500 men died that morning, defending 7 small towns, and the entire wealth of those towns came from a single thing: a bitter leaf from a holly tree. That was 1756. But the story of Yerba begins thousands of years before a single European reached South America. And it begins with a puzzle. Because whoever learned to grow this one impossible tree would come to control the richest economy on the continent. For a very long time, no one could. The Atlantic forest of the Upper Paraná. A holly, not a tea plant, rising 25 meters into the canopy. Its name is Ilex paraguariensis, and to the people who lived beneath it, it was already ancient. The Guaraní called it ca. They toasted the leaf, carried it crushed in small leather pouches, chewed it on long marches, and steeped it in a gourd drunk through a cane tube. It sharpened the mind. It pushed back exhaustion. It dulled hunger on journeys where food was scarce. Long before Europe knew it existed, this leaf was already fuel for the human body. But the tree did not give itself up. Cut the leaf and leave it, and within hours it blackens and rots, worthless by nightfall. And its seed is worse. It carries a shell so hard and an embryo so unformed that in the wild it sprouts only after a bird swallows the fruit whole and grinds the shell away in its gut. A leaf that spoils by evening. A seed that will not grow unless it first passes through a living animal. So for century after century, anyone who wanted this leaf had exactly one option: walk into the forest and take it from the wild. The tree refused to be farmed. Remember that. Everything that follows turns on it. The Guaraní beat the first lock with fire. A cut branch, still heavy with green leaves, passed straight through open flame for a few seconds, then dried slowly for hours over channeled smoke. That flash of heat did something they could not have named. It killed the enzyme that turns the leaf black, stopping the rot before it could begin. Chinese tea makers stumbled onto the same trick pan firing green tea, half a world away, in complete isolation. They did not know the word oxidase. They were doing it anyway. What they had built was worth more than they knew. In one of the most humid climates on Earth, they had taken a stimulant that spoiled the same day and made it stable, storable, and light enough to carry for weeks. This was not a drink. It was a portable engine, and it traveled along trade routes far beyond the forest, prized by peoples who could not make it themselves. How far that trade reached before Columbus is still debated. That the leaf was wanted is not. Then the Europeans arrived, and their first instinct was to burn it. To the Spanish, the sight of grown men drinking a dark forest, brew through a tube, all day, every day, looked like a vice. Governor Hernando Arias de Saavedra moved against it directly. Confiscated yerba was piled in the public square of Asuncion and set alight, condemned as an enemy of work, of man, and of God. A Spaniard caught with it paid 100 pesos. An Indian caught with it took 100 lashes. Priests called it a hallucinogen, an aphrodisiac, a filthy habit that favored lovers. An entire colonial government, armed with fines, whips, the church, and the open flame, set itself against a cup of tea. It lost. By 1620, the small town of Asunción was drinking through roughly 170 tons of yerba a year. Settlers went into debt for it. Some sold their clothes, their weapons, their horses to stay supplied. The men sent to stamp out the Indian vice had caught it themselves. And so, around 1630, the authorities surrendered and made it legal. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Because the moment yerba mate became legal, it became the most valuable commodity in the region. And that did something no governor intended. It was about to make one religious order unimaginably rich. The order was the Society of Jesus, and its work here turned on two men and one secret. The first was a priest named Antonio Ruiz de Montoya. By the time he rose to lead the missions, slave-hunting expeditions out of São Paulo, the banderas, were tearing through the mission country, dragging the Guaraní away in chains by the tens of thousands. The missions stood directly in their path. So Montoya did what few men would dare. He moved an entire people. He gathered 12,000 survivors and led them out, down the rivers in 700 rafts and canoes, then on foot around the great cataracts, carrying what they could. Hunger and disease walked with the column. By the hardest count, only a third lived to reach safety. Montoya buried thousands of the very people he was trying to save. And then he did not stop. 6 years later, having buried a third of his flock, he crossed the Atlantic to stand before King Philip IV himself and ask for something no one in Spanish America had ever been granted: the right to arm the Indians with guns. He got it. And when the slavers came again, 400 polistas and nearly 3,000 native auxiliaries expecting another easy harvest of captives, the missions answered with an army. 3,000 Guaraní militia, drilled and armed under a cacique named Nicolás Ñenguirú, met them on the river Mbororé. The fighting ran 3 days. The slavers broke, and they did not return in force. Mission Indians had done what no Spanish garrison could. They had stopped the slave raids with gunpowder of their own. But the guns were not what built the empire. Everything changed because of one discovery. Not the muskets, the seeds. Remember the tree that refused to be farmed? The impossible part was never harvesting it. It was making another one. For 1,000 years, no one had. Then, inside the missions, the Jesuits cracked it. They coaxed the stubborn seed to sprout, raised the seedlings, and planted the first true groves of a tree everyone believed could only be robbed from the wild. And they told no one how. What no colonist could grow, the order now farmed by the acre. Around 30 missions rose across the frontier. By a census of 1732, they held 141,000 people. Their finest grade of leaf outsold anything the settlers could strip from the forest, and the missions grew rich, self-governing, and armed. A Christian republic in the wilderness, paid for by a leaf. Now the slaughter at Caiboaté begins to make sense. Men do not die by the thousand for a drink. They die for everything built on top of it. But wealth has a habit of attracting kings. Histories like this one rarely reach a classroom. If you value deep historical investigations told with their full weight, subscribe before the next one. For a century and a half, the missions grew fat on that secret, and the wealth was their death sentence. Everyone could see it. The groves, the herds, the stone churches, the barter economy, a royal commission valued at 100,000 pesos a year. What no one outside the order could see was the method that produced it. To the settlers who could not compete, to the merchants who resented the prices, to two crowns that feared a state within a state, the missions became intolerable. A republic of Indians, armed, rich, and answering to priests instead of kings. And it stood on a fault line. The Guaraní held no title to a single acre. The land was theirs only, so long as the Jesuits stood between them and the state. In 1750, Spain and Portugal sat down and redrew South America with a pen. 7 of the missions, with their groves and their churches, fell on the Portuguese side of a new border, and the order came down. Abandon the towns, cross the river, leave everything. A leaf had become valuable enough for kings to redraw the map of a continent. They refused. Under a leader named Sepe Tiaraju, they took up arms, rather than surrender the land their grandfathers had cleared. Sepe was killed in a skirmish, and 3 days later, on that hill called Caiboaté, the reckoning from the opening of this story arrived. 1,500 dead against 4. The 7 missions fell, and the crowns had already chosen who to blame. The Jesuits, they said, had lit the fire. So they put out the order that had built all of it. Portugal expelled the society, then Spain expelled it from every dominion it held, and the priests who had run the missions were marched to the coast and shipped away. Civil administrators took their place, and what followed was not decline. It was collapse. They looted and mismanaged, the Guaraní scattered, and the groves that had taken a century to plant were left to the forest. The secret of the seed, guarded so fiercely, died with the men who kept it. Production fell back to what it had been before the Jesuits ever came. Gangs of men, sent into the wild to strip the leaves by hand, and the worst chapter had not even begun. A century later, Paraguay was destroyed in the War of the Triple Alliance, its people gutted, its treasury empty, its forests for sale. Foreign capital bought them. In 1886, a company with a bloodless name, La Industrial Paraguaya, took millions of hectares of Yerbales, and into them it sent men under a system called the Mensu. It was slavery dressed as a contract. A poor man, often unable to read, took an advance and a promise of work upriver. The moment he made his mark, the trap shut. In the forest, there was only the company store, and the company set every price, so his debt grew faster than his wage and never closed. Until it closed, he could not leave. And if he ran, the law itself chased him, because President Cirilo Antonio Rivarola had granted the employer the right to hunt down a man who fled and bill him for his own capture. In 1908, a writer named Rafael Barrett published what he found there. Between 15 and 20,000 human beings, he wrote, were being used up in the Yerbales. 70% of those driven up to the Alto Paraná were children. The forest trails, he said, were lined with crosses, and half of them marked the young. He named the company's administrators to their faces and called them despoilers, torturers, and murderers. This is the part that should make you angry. A boy bent double under a bundle of green branches, the smoke of the drying fires in his lungs, a ledger recording a debt he would die still owing. This was not simply a hard harvest in a remote forest. It was a hard harvest made catastrophically worse by a law that turned escape itself into a crime. Barrett was hounded out of the country. He died 2 years later, 34 years old. The crosses stayed where they were. The same leaf had crowned an order, enslaved a workforce, and buried children along a road. The consequences rippled far beyond the Paraná. The war over who would harvest this leaf fed straight into the campaign against the Jesuits across the Catholic world, and in 1773, the papacy dissolved the entire order by decree. The suppression had many causes, and no honest account blames it all on one plant. But the missions of Paraguay, and the wealth and independence they had built on Yerba were among the reasons the most powerful religious order on earth was, for a time, wiped off the map. A quarrel over a forest crop helped erase the Society of Jesus. And the border drawn through the missions in 1750 never faded. It hardened over the next century, into the frontier that still divides Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay today. But here is the strange and unexpected part of this story. The catastrophe did not kill the leaf. It freed it. As long as the Jesuits held the secret, mate belonged to an order, grown in a closed world, drunk within its walls. When that world was smashed and the grove spilled back into the wild, the leaf escaped the institution that had hoarded it. It passed to the gaucho, the cart driver, the soldier, the laborer. The empire fell, and the leaf it had guarded went everywhere. The empire disappeared. The leaf did not. In Argentina, it became the national drink outright. More than 200,000 hectares of it, a harvest close to 1 million tons in a single recent year. When the national football team flew to the World Cup in Qatar, they packed 1,100 pounds of it, unwilling to spend a month without it. In Brazil, it runs south through 3 states, ground fine and drunk hot from a gourd passed hand to hand around a circle, the exact gesture the Guaraní used, still alive inside the modern habit. In Paraguay, where the whole story began and the blood was spilled, they drink it cold now, packed with crushed herbs against the heat. And then, the strangest turn of all. In the 1850s, immigrants who had fallen in love with mate in Argentina carried the habit home to the Middle East. Today, the single largest foreign buyer of Argentina yerba on earth is Syria. A leaf the Guaraní made in a rainforest is brewed every morning in Damascus, half a world from the tree that grows it. 3 countries still supply nearly everything the world drinks, and the world drinks more of it every year. But this leaf is far more than a drink, and this last part tends to catch people off guard. The spent green waste at the bottom of the gourd, already steeped and thrown away, turns out to strip poison from water. Researchers use exhausted mate leaves to pull lead and chromium out of industrial wastewater, and mate extract to grow iron nanoparticles that clean contaminated rivers. The bitter leaf the Spanish once burned in the square is now enlisted, 4 centuries later, to scrub metal out of water. It was burned in a public square. It was outlawed by governors and whipped out of the hands of the poor. It was farmed in secret, then lost again. It built 30 towns, armed an army, and outlived the order that grew it. It was carried on the backs of children who lie under crosses along a trail. Not bad for a bitter leaf from a holly tree. That is why 1,500 men died at Caiboaté. Not for a drink, for everything the world had learned to build on top of a leaf. Empires vanished, armies scattered, borders moved. The people who first understood this tree were very nearly erased from the story of it. And still, every single morning, millions of people raise the same gourd to their lips and drink the last survivor of an empire, without ever knowing its name. Which part of Yerba Mate's journey caught you most off guard? The burning in the square, the secret locked inside the seed, or the crosses along the forest trail? Tell us in the comments.